Let us now turn to the keynote in our lecture series after sustainability. Professor Louis Kotzé, as you will see in a moment, is a perfect fit for this series. 2 years ago, we started this lecture series, and as you know from the title of the CSS is committed to sustainability, of course, but even in 2023, you might have to say that sustainability efforts are insufficient, still insufficient, or are a mere facade. 30 years after the Rio Earth Summit, environmental policy and its talk of preservation and precaution has largely failed. And it failed to deliver on the measures needed to limit global warming or biodiversity loss, or to buy enough time for an orderly, smooth transition to an ecological future. The sustainability paradigm can hardly be sustained, because in many dimensions, it is too late for creating an open, sustainable future. This is the starting point for the lecture series that explores different aspects of this topic, together with a series of distinguished guest speakers. The aim is to disorient and to disenchant current ecological debates and to go beyond techno and market fixes or beyond highly uncertain technological gambles. Instead, dilemmas and contradictions in discussions on possible trajectories of sustainability are focused. Louis Kotzé perfectly fits well into this focus. His lecture has already the title Environmental Law After Sustainability. And in his abstract, he states that the principle of sustainable development has to be completely replaced in favor of more radical concepts. Louis is, so to speak, a neighbor. He's currently program chair for the topic Governing the Planetary Commons at the new institute. And we are currently planning some cooperation regarding, for example, the governance of the deep sea. Louis is a research professor of law at the Faculty of Law at Northwest University in South Africa. He is also senior fellow in Earth System Law at the University of Lincoln, UK, and currently serves as the co-chair of the Earth System Governance Network's Scientific Steering Committee. Louis is a doctor of law, and he also received a PhD from Tilburg University. His research focuses on human rights, socio-ecological justice and environmental constitution making, law in the Anthropocene, and Earth system law. In 2022, Louis Kotzé served as the Klaus Töpfer Sustainability Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. Louis has over 200 publications on these aforementioned topics, and let me just indicate very, very few influential of these publications. In 2014, he published the article Rethinking Global Environmental Law and Governance in the Anthropocene. In 2018, he is a co-editor of the book Sustainable Development Goals, Law Theory and Implementation. In 2019 appeared the article Earth System Law, the Juridical Dimensions of Earth System Governance, and there in this article, as far as I understand it, you created this concept of Earth System Law and proposed it to the scientific community. In 2022, just last year, there appeared the article Scientific Evidence on the Political Impact of the Sustainable Development Goals, together with some other co-authors, among them Frank Biermann, who we also invited to give a lecture in the series, I think last year or 2 years ago. And you can see very clearly, Louis Kotzé is a very interdisciplinary researcher and a prolific thinker who critically questions the concept of sustainability. Just a quick word on the procedure. The lecture will be recorded. That's the reason why I'm wearing this microphone, and can be seen on our YouTube channel afterwards. There will be an opportunity for discussion afterwards, after Louis' presentation, but the discussion, however, will not be recorded. Louis, thank you very much for being with us, for accepting our invitation, and we are very much looking forward to your lecture.
There we go. So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the extremely kind invitation, for the very generous words of welcome, and also for giving a perspective on what you are setting up here. It's very encouraging to hear that it's not only South African universities that are experiencing some of these problems, but that it is challenges that we in the higher education sector face all over the world. Thank you also for the courtesy to allow me to speak in English tonight. I really do appreciate it. As I told Frank a bit earlier, my red wine German is better than my academic German, but we can test it afterwards, certainly. I'm really immensely grateful to be here and to share some thoughts from a legal perspective on basically what I think is wrong with environmental law and how I think it could be changed. But again, this is just my perspective, and I'm sure that there will be others, and I do welcome lively debate and your inputs on this. So basically, I want to talk today about how humans, through our social regulatory institutions, our governance institutions, and of course, part of those institutions also cover law, consciously, but often also unconsciously contribute to deepening the planetary crisis instead of addressing it head on. And more specifically, I want to exchange some ideas with you about what I think is wrong with environmental law and how we could imagine a new future paradigm for this, no doubt, important body of law. So many of our social institutions, including certainly environmental law, have been created to protect the environment, of course. But environmental law as an instrument, crudely put, to direct human behavior, I think has become unable to keep humans within the limits of the planetary boundary safe operating space. And we clearly see this in various contexts, ranging from environmental law's path dependency, its unresponsiveness to best available scientific knowledge, its lack of normative ambition that we clearly see playing out in the climate law domain. And certainly important for this evening's discussion, its neoliberal anthropocentric orientation. And I believe a key reason for its deficiencies is that environmental law is basically fully fashioned around the idea of sustainable development, as Frank has already mentioned in his summary. And while there are exceptions, of course, I think it's fair to say that sustainable development has become the central, if you like, constitutional principle of environmental law, guiding its shape, its content, and its objectives. And I will attempt tonight to expose the principle of sustainable development for the predatory, pro-growth, and exploitative principle that I think it is. And I will show that the major paradigm shift that we urgently require to confront the planetary crisis that we are right in the middle of will ultimately depend, I think, in unconditionally rejecting this principle in favor of far more radical reformative pathways aimed at future-proofing environmental law. And we will briefly look at the emerging paradigm of Earth system law, which could, among many other frameworks, this is not the only one, offer an epistemic framework to imagine a form of environmental law after sustainable development. And my thesis is, in a nutshell, that sustainable development, there depicted by the classic figure that we all know, is an improbable idea that is too rarely questioned. It promises what it cannot deliver due to its central contradiction between economic growth and ecological sustainability. It is based on the false promise that endless growth is actually possible on a finite planet, where the human footprint is already far greater than the Earth's ability to sustain life. And this false promise cultivates the delusion, certainly, of some form of infinite natural resources that will always be there forever. That the capitalist system specifically has at its disposal to also expand forever, while in fact the ambition of sustainable development is very much detached from the reality of an ever-deepening planetary crisis and a socio-ecological form of destruction on a finite planet. And I'm particularly concerned with the fact that environmental law seems to be complicit in facilitating the social ecological destruction, to the extent that sustainable development is a legally sanctioned ideological palliative at the very center of environmental law and governance that enables its proponents to rationalize the continuing destruction of a fragile Earth system rather than promoting planetary justice and integrity. Now, where did it all begin? And when did it start going wrong? You can easily say with Maggie and Ron, so to say, if you really want to pinpoint a specific point in history. Now, development, the fulcrum on which the notion of sustainable development, of course, revolves, emerged after the Second World War, as we know, is a way of incorporating the sort of erstwhile third world into the global economy on unequal terms. So the idea of development certainly was promoted by the West as a means of saving benighted and feckless developing countries from themselves. And the concept attracted criticism from the outset, but its advocates defended it as a form of progress, of course, through modernization, extractive industrialization, and economic growth, as the primary means of promoting human well-being and as the sole expression of material progress. And supporters of development conveniently, I think, discount the inconvenient truth, to use Al Gore's phrase, that all economic activity is intrinsically destructive when it involves the exploitation of the foundations of life on Earth, especially when you consider that there is only so much to go around. And mainstream hegemonic models of development have been particularly heedless of environmental destruction, despite repeated warnings about limits to growth, increasing evidence of Earth system decay, fast approaching planetary boundaries, and a looming sixth mass extinction event. And profit has persistently trumped people and the planet, driven by the logic of capital accumulation as the only measure of progress and well-being. So the intrinsic flaws of developmentalism, and by extension also of a new liberal form of sustainable development, are only now belatedly being acknowledged, at least in part, by institutions such as the United Nations Environment Programme, a long-standing promoter, to be clear, of green capitalism and the green economy, themselves oxymorons and terms used to window dress. UNEP's position aligns with the mainstream proposition that sees green capitalism and sustainable development as a sort of a combination of environmental and sustainability discourses with industrial and economic policy ones in a search of a unclear win-win solution in virtuous sort of cycles of progress and prosperity that they talk of. And it has taken several years, to be sure, for the world's foremost environmental champion, UNEP, that is tasked with global environmental protection, to finally accept in a recent 2021 report that, and I quote here, the current mode of development degrades the Earth's finite capacity to sustain human well-being, end quote. But having linked itself so tightly to sustainable development, as many international organizations do, UNEP is trapped within the mindset of human-focused developmentalism that consistently sidelines ecological sustainability. And global governance institutions responsible for environmental protection are clearly mired in a discursive straitjacket that makes it difficult or even illegitimate for them to question sustainable development orthodoxy. So as sustainable development becomes more deeply woven into hegemonic neoliberal discourses and gains wider acceptance, of course, decision makers are increasingly caught on the horns of a dilemma. Knowing that state practice has turned sustainable development into Hobson's choice, it is pursued despite and often precisely because of its intrinsic oxymoronic flaws, which facilitates the unambitious path dependency of environmental law. That is why sustainable development is so attractive, because no one knows what it is, in a nutshell. So the nub of the problem, certainly, is that all mainstream models of development are predicated upon economic growth, which flows from this dogmatic insistence that the current mode of purportedly sustainable development can somehow be tweaked in the right direction. No one knows exactly how, but it's possible. And this makes it impossible, I think, to reconcile ecological sustainability and sustainable economic growth. I mean, given Earth system limits, as we see also on this slide, endless growth cannot be sustainable. It is an empirical fact. Humanity currently already uses 74% more than the planet's ecosystems are able to regenerate, or 1,7 Earths. While 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been crossed, that's been estimated by Pick and Potsdam in a recent study, and the others are, of course, as we know, fast approaching. Yet, growth remains the main driver of globalized economic expansion, and its devastating effects on our shared world, while proponents of green capitalism, such as UNEP, continue to maintain that it is possible to grow our way to sustainability, among others through decoupling. The idea, or perhaps rather the fantasy, that economies can grow without increasing environmental pressures. Another concern is that GDP, gross domestic product, remains the predominant measure of development, growth, and national virility, despite persistent and growing criticism. GDP is primarily a measure of market transactions and output that ignores social costs, inequality, and environmental destruction. It has long been clear that GDP is a very, very, very poor proxy for social well-being, something it was never designed to measure. So I would suggest that the core problem with sustainable development is that it is merely another form of development rather than an alternative to development, despite what its main proponents, such as UNEP, would like us to believe. So whereas the former envisages development in a very different form, the latter regards the idea of development as irredeemably unsustainable, notably because dominant ideas of progress and well-being remain trapped within this often stifling interlinked confines of economic growth, GDP, and developmentalism. So sustainable development, as we know it today, and certainly as it exists within the legal domain, is therefore, in fact, unsustainable. Now, the problem of intrinsically unsustainable development is only one part of the problem. Equally problematic are the conflicting assumptions of sustainable development that have been and are being hardwired into environmental law and that drive social ecological destruction. So the fateful link between development and environmental protection in environmental law was made when neoliberal globalization became a hegemonic ideology. And as a result, over the course of the last 5 decades, at least, environmental law, and in particularly international environmental law, including the climate law regime, biodiversity regime, there are many others, has been instrumental in entrenching sustainable development as another ostensibly better form of development. And the perverse result of sustainable development's embeddedness in law and governance institutions is that it has weakened their capacity to ensure planetary integrity and the collective well-being of the living order in ways that are just and fair. And unfortunately, as an environmental lawyer, I need to confess that environmental law has played a pivotal role in turning sustainable development into a normatively, politically, economically, and socially very powerful concept. And I think, therefore, that environmental law is complicit in promoting a socio-ecologically destructive understanding of sustainability in a body of law that is actually supposed to be primarily concerned with maintaining and increasing planetary integrity. So environmental law, therefore, legitimizes a very wide range of socio-ecologically destructive practices under the banner of sustainable development. And in fact, I think that environmental law and sustainable development have become so deeply intertwined, so morphed in a sense, that some of my colleagues even claim to discern the existence of a new body of law called International Sustainable Development Law. Now, whether or not one agrees with this taxonomy, sustainable development appears to have become the sort of a foundational constitutional principle that orientates environmental law. And of greater concern, its core ethical orientation. And it is not coincidental that sustainable development and neoliberalism emerged at roughly the same time and became increasingly tightly interlinked following the World Conference on Environment and Development in 1987, with the publication, of course, now with the, as we know, the very famous Brundtland report on sustainable development, the report that really coined this term. Consensus was achieved at that conference precisely because the report's emphasis on development mollified developing countries, while its focus on economic growth mediated Western concerns. So it provided a solution for everyone. Without this compromise, I think it's correct to say, I might be wrong, but I think it's correct to say that the concept of sustainable development would not have emerged in the Brundtland report. The report formed the basis then, of course, for an international consensus that has been central to all subsequent global environmental conferences, at least. Precisely because it suppressed the contradiction between the ideal of endless extractive growth on the one hand and the real and very sobering limits of the Earth system on the other hand. It offered the delusion that mainstream models of development could easily be tweaked somehow to achieve social justice for everyone, everywhere, forever. And this is particularly evident, I think, in the Sustainable Development Goals, the latest incarnation of the world's sort of pro-growth and development vision. The SDGs, as we know, are not legally binding, so they are not, in a strict sense, international law, but they do have some form of normative power and steering effects through what Frank Bierman calls their governance through goals approach. And insofar, certainly, as some of the SDGs are linked to the more deliberate steering effects of international law. But the absence of an overarching environmental or planetary goal in the SDGs is remarkable. There is no, it doesn't exist. With all of the environmental protection goals consigned to goals 13, 14, and 15, way down at the bottom of the list of the 17 goals. So numerically and rhetorically, the list effectively makes development goals more important than the environmental goals. Scholars such as Eisenmenger and others argue also that the SDGs certainly fail to monitor absolute trends in resource use, and they therefore prioritize economic growth over ecological integrity, while they rely mainly on those institutions responsible for unsustainable resource use and partly propose measures that even reinforce current trends towards less sustainability. And other studies have demonstrated the extent to which the SDGs reinforce the anthropocentric neoliberal models of development on which environmental law has been constructed over the past 50 years. And more recently, as Frank has also pointed out, a study done by Utrecht University with Frank Bierman determined that the SDGs really have no meaningful positive steering effects on planetary integrity. and in other domains as well, but that was one of the focus areas. To give you one example, Goal 8, to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, is what this goal says, is fundamentally contradictory because sustained economic growth cannot logically be sustained if it depends on the limited foundations of a limited Earth system, as it does. So as Washington argues, in a finite world, we need to accept once and for all that sustainability cannot be about further growth. The challenge remains critical, though still denied. And the 2030 agenda contains obviously lofty ambitions and very stirring rhetoric, but no reference to or measure of strong ecological sustainability, or the need to protect planetary integrity, and very little resources to enable the world, especially the global south, to implement the SDGs in genuinely sustainable ways that promote inclusive well-being. So in the SDGs, as in much environmental law, truly sustainable development, therefore, to me at least, appears as a mantra that can be dispensed with as and when economic and political expediency so dictates. And I think that the risk of continuing down this very well-trodden path is that environmental law and governance plays a key role in reducing sustainable development to alluring promises that cannot be achieved, while it inhibits effective responses to multiple complex, multi-scalar, and interlinked existential social ecological crises in ways, of course, that must be fair, just, and inclusive. In the words of Agenda 2030, to leave no one behind, which is its central promise. It is rather the case that the combination of sustainable development and neoliberal globalization has increased inequality within and between states and made poverty, food, water, energy insecurity endemic. And environmental law is unable to tackle this challenge because its pursuit of sustainable development merely perpetuates the patterns of systemic inequality and insecurity occasioned by the very principle that it deifies. So they say environmental lawyers are the most pessimistic and depressive bunch of people in the world, and that is probably true. So I tried hard to end this with on a positive note, and hopefully I can do my best. And I think the message here is that sustainable development is not written in stone. It is a social political choice that we make. It's a choice. So to future-proof itself, environmental law, and I can only speak for my own discipline, can and will have to discard sustainable development as its central orientation and embrace, I think, alternative worldviews and orientations that can counter sustainable development's tenaciously malign influence on our living, very fragile living order. And in this respect, and while there may be many, many others, we don't have time, and I would love to hear if you've got suggestions, I want to suggest some broad outlines of possible pathways that I think could future-proof environmental law. And perhaps these suggestions also apply to some of the disciplines that you all work in. So first, central to any effort of environmental law's relinquishment of sustainable development will have to be the acknowledgement that merely altering environmental law's content, for example, by incorporating new principles such as in dubio pro natura, adopting provisions to declare ecocide an international crime. Some of you might have heard of this movement. Adopting rights of nature provisions, that's what everyone's talking about these days, or recognizing a global right to a healthy environment is necessary. It's all necessary, but insufficient to deal with the exigencies of the Anthropocene, as long as the deep-seated problems perdure with environmental law's form. So it's not only about the content, it must also be about the form. We need to change the form of environmental law. And deeper change will be needed to reorientate environmental law away from this neoliberal obsession that it has with sustainable development to alternative, ecologically sustainable ways of seeing, of being, of knowing, and of caring. And any reorientation effort will have to consciously, I think, embrace an awareness somehow of the deeper and enduring structural legacies of anthropocentrism, binary thinking, separating, to use the language that's used, man and nature, and the imbalance between legal protection of property on the one hand and environmental protection on the other hand. And driving this change, I'd suggest we'll have to start with us, people in this room, for example, through the work that we do in strategically shaping the discourse, which is important, to challenge the discourse, and hopefully eventually that could play out in the policy and political agendas and domains. Second, and relatedly, future-proofing environmental law will require a much more critical approach to making, enforcing, reforming, and teaching law. And again, this might apply to your disciplines as well. We need to become more critical. The growing critical legal studies movement is an encouraging example, certainly, of what is possible when we choose to reject long-held truths and outdated and invalid assumptions. When we challenge the status quo and think outside the stifling scientific and political confines that we often find ourselves forced into, to try and reimagine a new social order that is based on principles, new, perhaps more radical principles. And this is something that interests me, principles such as humility, respect, coexistence, sufficiency, interspecies justice, planetary integrity. This raises the question, is it not now the time to move away from the precautionary approach, from the polluter pays approach? They've been with us for 50 years. They haven't changed much. Let's think about radically alternative principles that are more caring, that speak to relationality, and that reconnects us with one another and with certainly also the more than human world. Third, we will have to become more sensitive, I think, to the need for embracing alternative architectures, and along with that, new key objectives of and for environmental law. Realizing that the planet is itself a living entity, famously expressed, of course, by the notion of Gaia, and that humans are small, we are small, but very powerful parts of the Earth system. I could think that environmental law should reorientate itself alongside and try to understand and respond to a complexly intertwined Earth system, instead of only focusing on some sort of externalized, beautiful, natural environment out there that humans can control, dominate, and protect, as we've been doing forever. And such a realization pushes us then to acknowledge that we are vulnerable because the Earth system is vulnerable. We are vulnerable entities who are part of a larger, coupled, vulnerable system. And environmental law will have to recognize the living order's shared but differentially distributed vulnerability. And it will need to devise appropriate ways to respond to this vulnerability at the Earth system or planetary scale of governance. And fourth and finally, I think lawyers generally, and certainly environmental lawyers, and perhaps that also applies to some of these in this room, specifically would need to open up the often confined, self-centered conversations that we tend to have only among ourselves about our expectations of the law and how we see this being achieved to a much, much wider and more representative set of actors, including natural social scientists, many of whom are in this room tonight, indigenous people, and emerging and increasingly influential actors such as activists. It is only in such a way, I think, that we could ensure that the best available science and experiences from other actors in social life, inform the design of law's ambition, scope, and objectives, and that law is actually then able and capable of responding to what science and people tell us is happening. So more inclusive conversations that facilitate processes of co-learning, I think, could also increase the legitimacy of environmental law, while ensuring that the interests of vulnerable entities that are usually underrepresented in formal legal, policy, and political processes are more fully being considered. So one framework which we could use to reimagine environmental law for the future is this concept of earth system law that we've been working on now for a couple of years, about 4 years. And our purpose with this framework is to present a new legal imaginary. It's a sort of a thought project. It's a thought experiment that endeavors to align law as an episteme, law as practice, and law as a discipline with an earth system perspective. And earth system law essentially, I think, urges a critical reflection upon law in this earth system context, thereby attempting to disrupt fundamentally the foundational assumptions of conventional law that I've just described earlier, and conventional law's inability to govern complex socio-ecological transformations. And this paradigm shift includes considering how law could better respond to earth system transformations, so the sort of external transformations caused by, among other things, climate change, but also how law itself must transform internally to better govern the socio-ecological aspects of earth system transformations. And while earth system law remains a work in progress, and there are some who absolutely don't like this concept, perhaps rightly so. And while it is a project that still endeavors to articulate its identity, boundaries, and its role as a scholarly movement and roadmap, hopefully perhaps one day for decision makers, I think it's fair to say that the concept is attracting a bit more attention and traction, which is great. And a survey of some key publications focusing on this concept, about 120 over the past 4 years, suggests that earth system law, in a nutshell, aims to discard this reductionist focus on the environment as its only primary concern, and rather turn its gaze towards the earth system and the planet-wide aspects as a governable domain. It acknowledges the expansion of the human enterprise from very localized areas, the urban level, city level, to the highest all-encompassing planetary level. It foregrounds complexity as opposed to this sort of sense of Holocene stability that we've been crafting and thinking about our social institutions for so many, many years. It acknowledges that ecological dynamism is an inherent characteristic of an interconnected, unpredictable, and complex Earth system. It embraces or seeks to embrace ecological reflexity, and it foregrounds the need for precaution and foresight. It also certainly rejects this dichotomy between humans and nature, and rather sees humans as part of the Earth system. We are the Earth system. We are not anything but that. It takes a broader inter- and intragenerational, interspecies view of justice, all the way up to the planetary scale. It emphasizes the importance of science to inform lawmaking processes and policy processes. And hopefully, also, it propagates a new ethic of care and responsibility. In conclusion, and I'm happy to talk more about Earth system law, perhaps over a glass of wine. I think that the failure of sustainable development to address the deepening socio-ecological crisis indicates that it is fatally disconnected from Anthropocene reality. Whether you agree with the term Anthropocene or not, let's just say it's fatally disconnected from the current planetary crisis that we find ourselves in. And I think very few would disagree that we are very much in the midst of such a crisis. As the Chinese proverb has it, the moral of sustainable development is that we should be careful what we wish for because it might come true. those who believe that sustainable development is actually capable of being reinterpreted and rebranded, such as very worryingly, the United Nations Environment Programme, have yet to provide, I think, a cogent, plausible explanation of how to resolve the oxymoron at its core. The impossibility of doing so underpins my contention that it is not credible to believe that sustainable development will ever genuinely be sustainable. It should therefore be rejected as irredeemably flawed for the reasons that I have argued. Abandoning sustainable development will require a massive paradigm shift in and of environmental law, policy, and governance, and this shift will have to go hand in hand with efforts to future-proof environmental law. And it's anyone's guessing whether this will happen, and if it happens, how it will play out. The current path-dependent trajectory that we see playing out, sadly, almost every year at the climate COPs, and in a couple of weeks we have the one in Dubai, suggests to me that this paradigm shift might not be coming very soon. But I do think if one must put a positive spin on the COVID-19 pandemic, that the Dean has also pointed out, this pandemic to me certainly has shown that what was previously regarded as impossible can rapidly become possible in the face of an existential threat. And the planetary crisis is the most urgent existential threat, obviously, that we've now faced and that we must confront head on. And I believe that humans will be able to respond to this crisis if we see it as a crisis. So perhaps the solution for environmental law and the sustainability conundrum lies in making humans see that the planetary crisis is actually a crisis. And then we will respond to that. In the small window of opportunity that remains, radical transformation that is driven in part by a new generation of environmental law is the only rational response, I think, to our unfolding socio-ecological crisis. Thank you very much.